Sarah's PubSpeak. And you might be wondering what the dismal science is. Well, the dismal science is actually economics. And indeed, much of what I'm going to talk about today is rather dismal. Lots of information about red ink, fiscal collapses, economic collapses, that sort of thing. But I believe it's also vitally necessary to understand this information, not only for our own economic well-being, but for that of future generations. My goal is to make information that is, usually esoteric and technical, understandable, and spoken in plain English. Then I'll leave you guys to, decide on your own personal choices about these issues, though I doubt the choices will be very hard to make once you understand the core economics behind them. Today I'm going to attempt to answer 3 pressing economic questions. 1, should we cut federal government spending? 2, should we raise the debt ceiling? And 3, what can we do about the present economic mess? But before I begin, I'm going to have to introduce to you the principal economic model that I'm going to use during this speech. It's called the expenditure model to calculating GDP, which sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. Simply put, GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the country's borders in a single year. And economists calculate GDP through expenditures with this equation. GDP politicians compare the United States government to one big, happy American family. They say that, in the face of this economic crisis, the government should act like a family. We should learn to tighten our belts and, cut spending and live within our means. Therefore, they say, we should not raise the debt limit and we should cut spending as much as possible. This is common sense, as politicians like to say. Well, sorry to break it to you, but that's fundamentally wrong. As it turns out, common sense is actually not that common. It's a fundamental misconception to compare, the American economy to a single household, because the U.S. government isn't like a household. Because an individual household is not the backbone of the world economy. When times are bad, the government shouldn't tighten its belt. Instead, it should spend money and do everything it can to get out of the mess it's in. Attempting to apply common sense principles to a system as intricate and complex and beyond, the scope of human understanding as the U.S. economy is blatantly dishonest. But, don't take my word for it. I'm actually going to show you some numbers now. So we're going to return to this equation of GDP I've shown you and plug in some real-world figures. Currently, U.S. GDP, unadjusted for inflation, is around $14.78 trillion. Okay? U.S. government spending, which is G in the equation, is around $3.8 trillion, which is around 25% of that total. Okay? So recently, President Obama has just offered cuts of $4 trillion over the next decade to Republicans in order to appease their so-called worries about, the size of the federal debt, taxes and whatnot. So $4 trillion over, 10 years translates to around $400 billion over each year, right? So let's put in these spending cuts into the equation. Let's subtract what President Obama is proposing and take out $400 billion out of federal spending. Okay, I'm not going to do the math on the board here, but you can take my word for it. So government spending will reduce by $400 billion for this year. And going back to the equation, we subtract $400 billion from this side, we subtract $400 billion in this side, and that leaves us with $14.38 trillion for GDP. All other things being equal. That's a 2.7% decrease in GDP. As a point of reference, in 2009, at the height of the recession in the United States, the U.S. economy shrank by 2.6%. So 2.7% U.S. recession, 2.6% in 2009. So President Obama, who's supposed to act as a sort of moderating influence on the right, is essentially advocating for a policy that will leave us in a worse state than at the height of the recession. Hey, but wait, that's not all. There's something called the fiscal multiplier. Basically, the money the government spends will have has an effect beyond just that set amount. That spending has a rippling effect throughout the whole economy. For example, say the government builds a major road for $100 million. Some of that money will go to pay, the private contractors who will build the road. Private contractors will use that money to, pay for their workers' wages, for example. And then some of those workers will use that money to go and, pay for their living expenses. So, like they'll go to a grocery store and, buy their groceries for the day. And then, some of that money they spend at the grocery store will, go to the wages of the grocery store employees and so on and so forth. So you can see how, the money the government spends has multiplicative effect. That's why it's called the multiplier throughout the entire economy. So the initial government spending will have a larger effect than at first glance. Economists currently estimate that on average, government spending has a multiplier of around 1.4. But let's be conservative here, and let's make that multiplier 1.3. So every dollar the federal government spends will actually have $1.30 impact on the economy. Now let's go back to this equation over here. 1.3 times 400 billion is $520 billion. Okay? And so instead of subtracting $400 billion, we're subtracting $520 billion. Okay? And then now we go back to the side of GDP, and we can calculate GDP equal $14.26 trillion. So now this is a 3.5% decrease in GDP. That's almost a full percentage point worse than during the recent Great Recession. A full percentage point worse than when 8.5 million Americans lost their jobs. A full percentage point worse when the United States plunged into its greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, a crisis from which 4 years later we have yet to emerge. Did you think 2007 to 2009 were bad? A recession of this size would be worse. And bear in mind, this is what the so-called moderates are proposing. I fault many economists for not expressing many of their findings in simple human terms. There are still people hurting out there from the recession that was supposed to have ended 2 years ago, caused by a financial crisis that began in 2007. I'm sure everybody in this room was either directly affected by the economic downturn, or at least knows somebody who was. Yet politicians, mostly Republicans but also some Democrats, are willing to risk that sort of pain again. Imagine all those people out there living day by day, paycheck to paycheck, struggling to get by. How do you think they'd fare if the economy took another blow like that? Now let's move on to a related question, one that has generated a lot of controversy on Capitol Hill, which is, should the debt limit be raised? First, a bit of background. The debt ceiling or debt limit is simply a legal cap on the amount of public debt the federal government can have. For example, if the debt ceiling is $10 trillion, the U.S. government is legally obligated not to incur a total debt over $10 trillion. In reality, the U.S. debt ceiling is currently $14.294 trillion. And on August 3rd of this year, U.S. public debt will hit that ceiling. Now the question becomes, what exactly happens when we hit that ceiling? Okay, simply put, catastrophe. If we hit the ceiling, the government won't be able to pay civil servants like congressmen and senators, though whether that's a bad thing or not is up for debate. All non-essential federal employees will be sent home. Worse, the U.S. government will be forced to stop sending Social Security checks, leaving 54 million Americans out on the cold. But that's not the worst part. The world economy is based on the assumption that the United States is a serious, responsible country. That's what's typically expected of the world's largest economy. Now, every U.S. government bond is essentially a tiny piece of U.S. public debt. Therefore, U.S. government securities and bonds are the safest investments any investor can make. Because as long as the U.S. government is still around, you're going to be paid back. So not only is the US the backbone of the world economy, it's the backbone of the world financial market. Therefore, the worst part of the US hitting the debt ceiling is the world could lose faith in the American government as a reliable creditor. The implications of this are disastrous. The US's credit rating would probably fall, and government bonds would no longer be considered safe. The collapse of 2007 was caused by, lack of confidence in several large financial firms. What happens when people lose faith in an institution as large as the United States government? I don't even want to consider the possibility. Suffice to say, the recession of 2007 to 2009 will look mild in comparison to what the ruin that awaits us should the debt ceiling not be raised. Hey, but what do you know? A certain major faction in the American political system has made the raising of the debt ceiling equivalent to religious heresy. This elephantine party refuses to raise the debt limit until both spending and taxes are cut. If the taxes don't go, this grand old party, who am I kidding, the Republicans, say they won't raise the debt limit, opening the economy up to the disaster I just described. If Republicans know anything about economics, they'll know that if it isn't raised, they'll be held responsible for possibly a second crash, or perhaps worse. I hope for the sake of my current standard of living that Republicans are only bluffing. I hope for the sake of my future job prospects that they'll come to their senses and raise the debt limit in the end. I sincerely hope this is just a cynical political ploy on the part of the Republicans, that they are merely threatening economic collapse as a means of furthering their political goals, because the alternative, that half of the leadership of our country do not understand basic economics, is far more frightening. Either way, doesn't it worry you that one of the country's major political parties is willing to gamble on the state of not only the United States economy, but that of the whole world? Okay, so I've talked a lot about doom and gloom. I've explained a lot of the problems. Now it's time for some solutions. What exactly can the US government do to get out of this mess? And the answer is actually quite simple, and you've probably heard it before. Stimulus. Stimulus is just trying to boost the G, government, in the GDP equation to compensate for deficiencies in other areas. For example, during the recent recession, consumption and investment fell. People simply didn't have the money or the inclination to go out and spend and invest. Now, this is where the government is supposed to step in and save, the shrinking economy. An increase in G picks up the slack, so GDP doesn't fall and the rest of the economy can get back on its feet. And to a certain extent, that was true. Congress famously passed a $787 billion stimulus package to speed the recovery. Much of that came in the form of tax cuts, which actually have a lower multiplier than public spending. But even so, let's be generous and say that overall, the stimulus had a multiplier effect of 1.3. So I'll write these numbers out. So $787 billion in stimulus times a multiplier of 1.3. And that's an increase in G of around $1.1 trillion. But there's a bit of bad news as well. Those $1.1 trillion were meant to close the gap left by falling C and I, and that gap was larger than $2 trillion. So yes, the stimulus helped. Things certainly would have been worse without it. We'd have seen more job losses, we'd have seen more businesses go bankrupt. But did it succeed in its purpose to prevent widespread unemployment and pull the economy out of the recession? That's doubtful. Okay, now let me read you a statement written by a certain modern American president. I think you'll find it rather relevant. I wish to emphasize to the full extent of my ability the necessity, as a fundamental to recovery, for the utmost economy of government expenditure of all kinds. Our people must realize that government cannot continue to live in a depression upon the scale that was possible in times of great prosperity. The developments of the past week should give great assurances to the country. The public statements of the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate and House show a real nonpartisan determination and cooperation with the administration to assure the country of the balancing of the federal expenditures and income for the fiscal year beginning July 1st. The amount of taxes we will need to impose for this purpose will depend entirely upon what further cuts we can make in government expenditures. That president was not Barack Obama. It was Herbert Hoover in 1932. And thanks to his failed policies, the U.S. stayed in depression until the administration of FDR. But right now, it certainly isn't too late for our current president. What we need is a second stimulus, one large and bold enough to pull this economy out of the recession. What we need isn't another round of massive tax cuts, but large-scale government intervention to give people jobs and improve the economy. Spending on the order of around $1 trillion to put people back to work and get the economy back on its feet. What we need is, in essence, a second New Deal. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about some of the things we could do with this stimulus money here. So if you like it, please feel free to snap. Okay, so currently, according to the World Economic Forum, America's infrastructure ranks 23rd in the world between Spain and Chile. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates this country needs approximately $2.2 trillion in public infrastructure spending. Let's take that advice and invest in our highways, bridges, and airports. Let's improve our road system and reduce productivity-killing traffic jams. Let's build those great public works like the Hoover Dam that FDR built during the New Deal. China's taken the world's crown as the builder of great things. Let's reclaim that title. But the stimulus should look towards more than just infrastructure. Let's invest in the American future as well. Currently, we spend only 3% of our federal budget on education. Let's double that, build new schools, write new curriculums, pay teachers competitive salaries. Let's finance the country's great public universities and make a good education accessible to all. Let's develop programs to help the underprivileged and help them climb out of the vicious cycle of poverty. Properly paying for the country's education will pay dividends later on. Going with that, let's invest in science and technology. Let's fund large-scale research projects in new fields like genetics, biotech, artificial intelligence. America's space shuttle fleet just flew its last voyage. Isn't it incredible that 30 years later, NASA is still flying the same spacecraft? NASA's budget is currently less than 1% of the federal total. You could add 1 cent to every tax dollar and double NASA's budget. Let's do that and reach for the stars. See, if you think about it, government spending isn't that scary of a thing after all. It doesn't have to be huge and impersonal. Yes, government should stay out of our private lives, but doesn't it have a part to play in improving the quality of those lives? Stimulus money can be spent on some really cool things, improving America's competitiveness, and most importantly, putting Americans back to work. So that's the case for more stimulus. Okay, in conclusion, if average Americans understood many of the issues I presented today, they wouldn't be at home watching American Idol or playing video games. They'd be in the streets. The National Mall would look like Tahrir Square with people calling for politicians' heads. But unfortunately, your average American does not understand. And your average American politician is betting his political career on that lack of understanding. This applies to both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. Republicans for misleading their constituents and gambling on the fates of millions, and Democrats for lacking the backbones to stop them. My high school econ teacher has a joke. What do you call a politician whose constituents understand economics? Answer, an ex-politician. The American people have been consistently browbeaten, misled, and outright lied to. Millions of citizens consistently vote against their economic interests, for giant faceless corporations, not for individuals, for taxes to a tiny privileged minority, not the middle class, and for special interests, not the rescuing of the American economy. But we can change that. With political will, things can get better. If we want to see our way out of the current mess, it's every American's obligation to understand at least the basic principles behind economics. And I hope I've done at least some of my part to improve that understanding. Thank you.